I'm here. I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. We just went over, you were hearing the rules, 2-minute opening comments, 1-minute retorts, couple questions from me, then we're handing it over to the audience. So with regards to the issue of vulnerability disclosures, reverse engineering, the good, the bad, whatever their opinions may be, let's hear it first from Katie Masuris.
Okay, so with regards to that comment from Marianne Davidson about hackers should be prosecuted for reverse engineering and finding security vulnerabilities, that's a really interesting stance because, quite frankly, there are 3 ways to find out about security vulnerabilities. Marianne did a good job of talking about ways that Oracle tries to find its own. That's way number 1. You can also have, you can hire people outside of your organization to find out. That's also considerably, well documented as a way to find out about vulnerabilities, right? And those are all, under NDA or within an organization. The second way is for somebody to tell you about it from the outside. And the third way is to find out because of an attack or a failure of the system. So when I look at reverse engineers and the role that they play in security, I look at them as providing a service to the organization in question, because they're catching things that that organization couldn't find itself, or that it might have found but decided not to fix, thinking that maybe nobody else would find it. So they're pointing something really relevant out, which is that that issue is actually discoverable, potentially by an adversary, and they're warning that organization before it's used in an attack. So from my perspective, rather than being criminally prosecuted, these people are heroes. These people should be rewarded if appropriate, and potentially hired to find even more bugs. And one other thing is that often software and hardware companies use security through obscurity to hide defects and hide things. And you might have heard that Volkswagen was actually using some fraud, and a reverse engineer discovered that they were cheating on an emissions test. So instead of prosecuting the hacker, I think vendors should be accountable.
So the words I'm hearing are hire hackers and bug bounties are good is the fundamental bottom line. What do we think of that?
All right, so
Mark, your turn.
can you hear me? Just put me a thumbs up. Yes, you can?
That was almost an Obama move.
Can you hear me, Kate?
We can hear you. We can hear you, Mark.
Okay, so I'm going to begin like any lawyer with a disclaimer, and that says that even the opinions that I express here may not be my own opinions. So any good lawyer starts anything with a disclaimer. However, having said that, let me present the position of a software developer. And the basic position is, it's my code, I get to decide what to do with it. I license that code to other people, subject to conditions that I put on that code. If I want to hire somebody to reverse engineer the code or to test it, then I can do that. But you don't have any rights to reverse engineer my code, even if my intent is to tell me what you find, other than the rights that I grant you in my code. Even when you install code on your computer, I own the code, and I give you a license. And that license is subject to copyright law. That license is subject to the terms and conditions of the end user license agreement. When you use my code, it's still my code on your machine, in excess of what I have granted you permission to do, you're violating the contract and you're violating copyright law, and I have the right to go after you. When you're penetrating my network, even if you have good motives, if you do it without my consent, then what you're doing is you're accessing or attempting to access my network without authorization, and that violates the computer crime statute. So basically, my answer is, who died and made you God?
All right, so what I'm hearing here, Mark, for clarification, is that you wrote the code, you are the copyright holder, therefore it is up to you to make all decisions as to how that code is used. Am I interpreting that correctly?
That's correct.
Fair enough. Opinion number 2. Now, Dave Cronister from Show Me Con, apologize, in Missouri. You kind of indicated a slightly different position when we were talking on some of these issues.
Yeah, and I just always end up being the middleman in everything, so it worked out great. I guess the woman who made that discussion, I'm sorry, I'm horrible with names. She says, well, it's our licensing, if it's our vulnerability, we should deal with it. If she wanted to prosecute her neighbors when they find that her back door's open and unlocked, you're saying, well, it doesn't matter about, they are the copyright holders. So should we take this to the nth degree that Mark Twain or whoever received a notice that there's misspelled words in his book, that he should go ahead and that person should be fined for finding an error? The biggest problem that you have with this on saying it's illegal is, well, guess who doesn't follow the law? Criminals. The people that are finding these are dealing with real issues like we just talked about here. The other problem is it's not like I'm going to their servers all the time and the vulnerabilities are only on their servers. This could be on my system as well. And the way that Mark was speaking about this, basically he's saying, listen, it doesn't matter what sort of harm I put your system at, and let's face it, with the internet, this could be physical damage. Because it is my software, leave your hands off of this. This is not so, I feel kind of not fair because Mark's not here to defend himself. This is not something that we should really look at. Now, he did bring up one point that I do agree with, and this is kind of where the middleman is. I think all three of us will agree on a lot of issues here. It's the nuances which make these fun. It's different when I am actually testing for bugs in my own environment, whether it be your software or what. When you get into another area where it's someone else's physical property or you're in the public and you can cause harm to others, that's where I agree that we need to do something.
All right, to paraphrase what I'm hearing is this little wishy-washy kind of in the middleman thing, but you made a distinction here that I think is very interesting, that if you are a penetration testing team and you're doing a vulnerability of assessment of a given organization, it's okay if you do it on their premises because it's on their physical premises, but whoever said software was physical, which I'm sure would be part of the argument back from Mr. Rash. Katie, 1-minute retort, especially for Mark, I have no doubt.
Well, Mark, unfortunately, the audio made you sound like Charlie Brown's teacher, so I'm going to just go with what Wynn's summary of what your argument actually was, because your words were hard to parse for me. But, essentially, you brought up the Internet of Things, actually. I want to touch on that point when I talk about Mark's. Most of the Internet of Things vendors just suddenly realize that they're also software vendors, and they're not actually used to writing more secure code. And a lot of the things that are pointed out to them by somebody doing research, it's often their first time actually understanding that they have a security vulnerability. So I think that more of those vendors actually do need to have a way to receive those vulnerability reports from security researchers. And in fact, in the medical device world in the US, the Food and Drug Administration has issued guidance to them to say that they need to be able to receive vulnerability reports from researchers. So we're seeing a trend towards more and more people allowing their devices to be tested for security bugs, even when that device is not, is physically somewhere else.
Mark, you want to take that? 1 minute.
Sure, but about you and Katie, could you just summarize it? Because I can hear you, Wynn.
All right, she is taking the position that the community and some software organizations are already tacitly allowing it, or in some cases actually really allowing it to take place.
Well, and actually federal regulators in the United States are starting to issue guidance to tell vendors that they should allow it because they realize the value of security research.
Okay, so about knowledge and consent. If the software owner either expressly or implicitly gives consent to the software, there is no problem. If I invite people to try to hack my software or to try to hack my network, then I've given consent to do it. Where we run into problems is when people try to do this without my express consent. Now, Katie's talking about the middle area where I don't actually prevent them from doing it, I don't actually give them consent. And that's a middle area, so I have the right to give to them, but I may choose not to do so.
Dave, how do you voice in on this?
So I guess there's a couple areas I'll address Mark's real quick. Again, you just said that if me as a pen tester, when I go in and I do an assessment, that I am giving consent. Yet, however, when we're talking about what if it's actually an Oracle database, do I now have to go to Oracle and get consent to pen test on somewhere else, which, by the way, is federally regulated for companies to now do penetration testing? You know, there's a certain distinction there where we have to draw the line. Again, it's one thing if I was going after Oracle systems on Oracle's property. I agree with you, especially when we start talking about 0 days. Now, the problem with security researchers, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of good security researchers out there. However, there is no standard out there. And some of the problems is you may have a security researcher working in a university that is funded, that has errors and omissions insurance. They may have really good credentials. A security researcher may be a 15-year-old that once they get this information may not know what to do with it tremendously. So I think that there needs to be some sort of industry standard.
Now, Mark, one of the points that Katie made earlier with regards to this, and you've been making with regards to copyrights, obviously there's some different opinions here. She made the point that, or maybe Dave, you made the point, who's going to do the code? If the good guys don't look at the code, the bad guys are going to have
criminals
to look
break the
at the
law.
code. However, there may be some issue of copyright law. However, can you address the issue, Mark, of how copyright law applies in all 217 countries equally with equal amount of litigation ability?
Well, no. I think here's the interesting thing about law. Copyright law in the U.S. Copyright law in the U.S. expressly permits a certain amount of reverse engineering of code. But the problem with the way the copyright law is interpreted is this. I own the copyright, and therefore I control the software. If you want to get access to the copyright software, you have to agree to the end-user license agreement. I will write in the end-user license agreement terms and conditions that give you the right and intent.
Mark, we lost audio. Somebody wave at Mark. Mark, we lost your audio. Don't we love Skype? That's the right answer. All right, we're going to reconnect again. I know Mark has been consistently talking about copyright law, and one of the things he mentioned was EULAs, and we have all clicked, I agree, and how many times have we actually read them? Does that really matter here, Dave?
I don't think it really does. I mean, I'm a huge South Park fan. If anybody here is a South Park fan, and they hit this just perfectly with the Apple copyright. You know, we do have something called the prudent man rule, that we should do whatever it takes, what a prudent man would run with. I think for our own personal safety, again, when we start to get into Internet of Things and the stability of our organization, if there really is an issue, you're going to tell me I can't do anything because you've copywritten it? So then should I sue you for liability because you put a crap product out? I mean, this starts to get us going down this complete slope of never-ending litigation. And you know what doesn't get fixed? The security issues. And again, as we've talked about before, the only people that are going to be exploiting them are nation states and criminals.
Katie.
Yeah, I've actually never run into a security vulnerability that was fixed by lawyers and lawsuits. That has never, in my long career, has never actually occurred. So what I have seen are big policy shifts and changes about consent. And And what Mark was talking about there is there's an exemption in the Digital Millennium Copyrights Act to perform reverse engineering for security research, but it's only with consent. Now, how many of these vendors who are not even paying attention to security in the first place are about to give their consent? And these are the vendors that are putting out things that are going into, many medical devices, self-driving cars, all kinds of things where they're not going to provide that exemption, that legal exemption. So we're left with a situation where a hacker who might find something, and it might be on purpose, or it might be what I call a hackcident. It might be an accident that they find it. They are now faced with a dilemma. Do they try to report it and risk legal prosecution because they know they didn't get consent first? Or do they let people potentially suffer from the insecurity? And I don't think we should leave an ethical dilemma like that for hackers. I think we should make it absolutely clear that there's a safe harbor if they want to report a vulnerability.
Mark,
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
we can hear you now.
First of all, this could result in never-ending litigation. Like that's a bad thing.
Says the lawyer.
Says the lawyer, of course.
But here is the real problem. The problem is that software developers, because of copyright law, have a monopoly in what they've developed. So they have a certain, what the law calls a bundle of rights in that software. They then use that bundle of rights to get you to sign or agree to an end-user license agreement that nobody ever reads. That end-user license agreement gives them many more rights than the copyright law ever gave them. So, for example, the end-user license agreement may have terms that say, you can't tell anybody that this software, you can't benchmark software. You can't take this software outside the United States. You can't complain if the software doesn't work and destroys all of your data. There's nothing in the copyright law that says that. It has to buy a copy of the newspaper Le Monde and having the copyright as a condition of being able to read the newspaper. And you can never talk about what's there. If you agree to that as a condition of buying the newspaper. So what software developers are doing is they're using copyright in the code to get all kinds of rights that they don't otherwise have. Okay? And that's really the problem when we talk about testing and reverse engineering is where do you draw that balance?
He's a lawyer. It's okay. I grew up an analog engineer in the hardware world, and throughout at least one of the presentations today was on some very interesting issues regarding cracking into and bypassing physical security devices, and in some cases it's hardware reverse engineering, maybe a little bit of firmware. Katie, from your position, hardware reverse engineering, firmware and software, are they the same? Should they be the same? And what is your vision of this?
Well, no hardware usually works unless it actually has firmware. Firmware is the software that interfaces and makes the hardware work. To me, I look at all reverse engineering as a very, very highly necessary skill set to secure the planet. There's hack the planet to secure the planet, and I look at them all as the same. I am very much of the opinion that if you can find a vulnerability, that it's possible that somebody else can find it as well. And the worst thing that can happen for security is threatening researchers such that they go underground and non-disclosure. It's not that, threatening researchers and they decide to sell it somewhere, somewhere where someone's going to use it for attack. It's actually masking the discoverability of these flaws via reverse engineering that's most dangerous for security. And masking it is as a result of all of this fear of litigation and prosecution. And I think that not only silences the researchers, but it actually makes security worse in the long run. So, in the future, I would love to see a clear and easy way for researchers to report vulnerabilities without fear of prosecution.
Okay, what company owns Skype?
I had to make that joke once.
Never mind.
That
We're going to wait for Mark for 1 second because I want him to get into some of this hardware issue. and so he can hear the question, because I grew up in that world, and we had some very strong feelings. Mark, can you hear us now? Okay. Mark, I want to take what Katie said and add one piece of information. Back in my day... What was that? Can you hear me now?
Give me a second.
Oh, that's much better. Your audio is better, whatever you just did.
Okay.
Okay. Back in my day, we used to design amplifiers and circuits to do audio. There is only so many ways you can take a single transistor and make it amplify something 12 dB. And back in those days, there were some attempts at copywriting hardware. How does the hardware, firmware, software make a distinction from your perception of reverse engineering?
Okay. Distinction between software is slowly disappearing, and no evidence in the internet thing.
Can you get closer to your microphone, Mark?
I assure.
Mark, can you get closer to your microphone? Can you wave at him, Dave?
Embedded software.
Mark, can you lean closer into the microphone? Because it's really breaking up.
We're going to try it.
We're going to try a new technology.
If only some reverse engineer were
Reverse
to help
engineer it, you'll get good.
make this work. Oh my God.
Okay, give it a go.
Okay. I think I have you now.
Okay, go.
Yep.
It's better.
Okay. I can hear you now. Okay, good. All right. One of the things I think is important is that the distinction between hardware and software is going to disappear. Because increasingly you will have things like light bulbs with embedded software or embedded software.
Say that last sentence again. Can you say that last sentence again, please, Mark?
Keep talking.
No, I was just going to ask you to, we lost the last sentence of what you said, and now we're going to lose you again.
I asked you to bring me a bottle. Okay. That's why I asked.
All right, Mark, try again.
Do we have any help desk people here?
Maybe if we don't send him video, maybe it'll be a little better for the bandwidth. All right, we're waiting. Keep talking.
If this works.
Okay, give it a go. All right, so much for Skype right now. Dave, let's get your opinion on, wait a minute, is he here? No. Let's get your opinion on the hardware, software, firmware that Katie was addressing. She doesn't see a whole lot of difference. And in my world, I do see a big difference because I used to be a hardware designer.
I think Katie and I are going to agree on 90% of everything. And I kind of honestly think the differentiators we have are a little different, are not that different. The big issue I have, when I talk about hardware, let's look at it even outside of computer hardware. I'm a guitarist. I've played for 30 years. The first guitar was made from a lute. It was changed into a different instrument in the 1900s. That's not a guitar. That sounds like Jimi Hendrix. Les Paul, he did not reinvent a new instrument. He reverse engineered it, made it better. Leo Fender, in my opinion, made a Fender Strat, which made it even better. We sometimes have to be on top of giants. That is, we have to reverse engineer to make it better. Why start from scratch every single time? I think no one would disagree. If I reverse engineered it, a la the Chinese, and re-engineered it exactly the same, there's a problem. If we reverse engineer something and we find an issue, it's not really a problem. The problem is what do we do once that happens? Are we responsibly disclosing it? Are we giving it to the right people? Are we going to a con and showing how cool it is before it's actually being fixed? That's my big issue there. And again, hardware and software, there will always be distinctions. We're meat space, we're info space.
All right, now we're going to try this with video only in one direction now. Mark, give it a go. Go.
I hear you. I don't know if you can see.
We can see you.
So there's no doubt that a team of people in software, I brought my own. Of course, it's 11 o'clock here in the morning. It's never too early for wine, right? So there's no doubt that a team of people reversing code will look to find vulnerabilities. And if those vulnerabilities are properly addressed by the developer, they can make the code better, more secure. The question is, what mindset?
All right, Mark, this is probably clearly not working. Dave, you want to wave at Mark? And
There's no camera on this side.
No camera.
all right, he agrees with what he's saying. Can you type to him and tell him that the audio is gone and we may need to disconnect this and continue without him?
He should try it with no camera on his end.
Yeah, try it with no camera, one more shot. One of the cases that, in fact, because of that industry, there was a case legally where I believe it was Gibson sued Ibanez in the 1970s for copying guitars.
Yeah. And they lost. Ibanez is still making guitars.
I have 3 Ibanez lawsuit guitars.
If you're a big fan of them, I mean, it's kind of like someone trying to copyright something like air or using the word a. It just doesn't work. There is this whole idea of certain technology will eventually be made by someone, no matter who it is. That is there really a point that one person can hold all this power, or is it just that they were at the right time at the right place? Who invented the telephone?
Well, according to Mark, it's the copyright holder. If Katie designs all of this code and somebody reverses engineers it, she's okay with that. Richard Stallman is okay with that. Mark and many companies like Oracle are not okay with that. So
let me be clear. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act in the U.S. and similar copyright infringement protection laws around the world are not. They were there to protect ideas, not there to mask security bugs, and yet those laws are being used to prosecute and suppress security research. That's my problem with these things. I'm not really, as a whole, against people protecting their ideas. But if your idea is to have a whole bunch of security bugs, well, maybe that idea does not deserve protection.
I'd be curious, what's the degree that Mark would agree with this? Is this the point that if someone's doing this, that they're sued, that there's a restraining order, or they go to jail?
Do we have any audio for Mark? Yeah. So it says we have a Skype connection, and we clearly don't. Olivier, maybe we can try to initiate again. Appreciate it.
So I can talk about, there's an exemption process that happens every 3 years in the Digital Millennium Copyrights Act, and one of the exemptions that got put in this last year was actually to allow hardware reverse engineering for security research without that magical consent bit. So most of the things that are now authorized, there's a 1-year waiting period, except for one type of device. Can anyone guess what that kind of device is? It's not a car, It's not a plane. It's voting machines. So voting machines are allowed to be reverse engineered with this new Digital Millennium Copyright Act exemption that just got passed, and they are immediately allowed to be reverse engineered because the risk of voting tampering in an election year in the United States is so high that the folks who were approving the exemption decided that, yeah, it's actually necessary to give hackers a clear safe harbor to be able to reverse engineer looking for security bugs in voting machines. The rest of the devices that are part of that exemption that's new this year are on sort of a waiting period so that the auto industry has a chance to respond and figure out what they're going to do, the medical device industry, et cetera. So those exemptions come up every 3 years, and there's a 3-year review for them. I think it's a great victory for security in general that those exemptions were put in. What I would like to see is for them to become permanent exemptions in that law and in laws around the world.
Do we have Mark at all?
That's okay, I can just argue.
Mark? Okay, we don't have Mark. This is not good. All right, I want to follow this up because you're bringing in a lot of comments have come up that are very, very interesting, and some of them begin approaching some definitely ethical sorts of dilemmas. One of you mentioned something about the medical devices. Medical devices, those, if they, and I wish Mark were here for this, but if medical devices say, do not reverse engineer me, somebody finds a bug in it through whatever mechanism, does that ethical dilemma override any legal rights that might exist?
I would like to speak on this. If you can't see, this is a pacemaker. I have personal stake in this one. I'll tell you what, if the government, and again, we're a little freer to speak about the U.S. government in the United States, said, no one can reverse engineer this, it's up to you, I would say, screw you. I don't care. I don't care. The big issue I run into, and again, is how they're released. In August in Las Vegas, there's quite a few conferences that people attend that a lot of these magic shows happen. I've actually sat in a couple of talks where people have actually talked about how to actually disrupt pacemakers and defibrillators and things like that. I know there's vulnerabilities. There's a little bit of an issue there. Why are they not talking to Medtronic? Why are they not discussing it with the other people? Again, if you're doing responsible disclosure, part of that responsibility is to give the companies time to actually fix it. And unlike a car, which a new model comes out every year, a pacemaker, I've had this since 2003, it's replaced once. That vulnerability will be in my body for the next 16 years. If you're doing this to actually fix a problem and not to become a, quote, InfoSec rock star, to steal that quote from Mr. Street, you'll wait that time. You will work with that industry, and there are researchers that do that.
Well, Tesla came to DEF CON, what was it, 2 years ago, and they said, hack our car, but they didn't really allow that much.
So I do want to respond to the subject that is literally near and dear to your heart. It is literally right there. And that's the fact that a lot of medical device manufacturers don't have a way to receive vulnerability reports. They have no published security contact. So it's actually quite difficult to find someone to report it to. Also, a lot of security researchers have tried to contact those medical device manufacturers, and guess what happens? They get sent a cease and desist, which is, legally basically telling them to GTFO and not come back and not do any more research. So security researchers have contacted organizations like Medtronic and other devices and tried. Now, I think that if an organization is actually open to working with security researchers, they are following the ISO standard for vulnerability disclosure, of which I'm an editor, and they have a published way to reach them, and the researcher still, decides not to go that route and just to release it and release exploit code, that's one thing. But that's actually quite rare, especially around researchers who are doing research on medical devices. A lot of them, they're doing this at great legal risk to themselves, and they're reporting them at great legal risk. And so the last thing I'll say about it is the Food and Drug Administration has had to tell medical device manufacturers to dispel a myth. So the medical device manufacturers were saying to some researchers reporting, they were saying, you know what, that is a valid security issue, but if we were to issue a patch, we'd have to go and get recertified for use in the field by the FDA, so we can't patch it. And that's a lie. And so the FDA now is telling the medical device manufacturers, stop lying and using us as the bad guy. We're telling you, you need to respond to these security issues and you need to find a way to fix them.
Mark, do we have you?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Perfect. Okay. This is the triumph of effort over technology.
Yes, it is. Basically, Katie was just discussing some of the recent changes in the laws with hacking, quote unquote, medical devices that researchers receive. Cease and desist letters, and now the FDA has been telling the vendors, oh, wait a minute, you got to be a little nicer than that. How does that affect any of your position? Do you agree with that?
So,
Don't fall off the stage.
Oh, I have fallen off. Bigger stage. All right, video is stopped. Thank Mark for trying, and tell him I'll call him tonight.
Okay, can I respond one
Please do.
thing here? And I think this is where the big difference is going to be. I agree with you 100%. In our firm, we have found 0 days before, and it's been everything from thank you very much to, well, why did you do that? Again, especially on, and it was incredibly stupid stuff. Here's the problem. We're dealing with lawyers, we're dealing with legislatures, we're dealing with people that do not understand security. And I think where the wishy-washiness comes in is, I don't think something should be illegal. I think security research needs to be done, but we need to put our big boy pants on as an industry and say, listen, if you're going to do security research, you need to have these qualifications. If you're going to do vulnerability disclosures, you need to do it in this format to these people. If they are not going to respond within a certain amount of time, an industry-accepted amount of time, then we go to the next step. And that may be where you throw out that 0 day as public domain. But we need to have it in some sort of real world terms, because I can tell you what's happening on the other side. The first, if they receive that vulnerability or that exploit or any white paper, their lawyers are going, nope, nope, nope. This, you are admitting there may be an issue and you are going to have a class action. I've sat on phone calls with lawyers that wanted to have class actions against some really well-known vulnerabilities that have been discovered. And I said, you guys are idiots for doing this. Number one, there's compensating controls. Number two, you are hurting the cause. Suing companies is not going to make things better. Opening a communication, but a communication that works good for both in both ways, is going to be the best way to do it.
Mark, are you there with any audio? All right.
Oh, wait.
I was going to follow up because you were kind of talking about certification for researchers and
not necessarily certification, but there's things.
Standards of performance. Is there, because there's nothing right now.
I really think in our entire industry we need to. I mean, let's face it. Who here is Red Team? I've done Red Team. Yeah, I've done Red Team. We do pen tests all the time. SysDreams does pen tests. I can't even begin to tell you how many times I go in after a company who's done a really good pen test, and it's a Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer report. It is one of these. This is systemic across the entire industry, but for vulnerability research, I think this becomes very important because not only is it that you're not just running an exploit that's well known, you are breaking something, and you better have very good understanding of what you're doing. And I think insurance, different things like that, you need to have that to be able to do this in a secure and in a good way.
Responsibility. Katie.
Okay, so let's drop some actual statistics around this. How many of you think that all vendors are prepared to hear how they have security flaws? Great, 0 of you. The actual statistics in the Forbes Top 2000, these are companies who are publicly traded, make a lot of money, spend a lot of money on security. 94% of them have no published way to report a vulnerability to them. So when I hear things like, well, researchers need to do this and researchers need to do that, what about these companies who have tons of money, spend tons of money on security, and they have 0 process to hear about their flaws from the outside? That, to me, is the bigger end of the problem, not what the researcher's doing. Further, I've seen researchers who are as young as 5 years old find authentication bypasses. The youngest hacker that I ever had to send some kind of bounty-ish thing to was a 5-year-old who found an auth bypass in the Xbox Live password field. 5 years old. I cannot imagine any kind of regime that required certain behaviors and certain ways of doing things when you have the most creative security researchers and hackers under the age of 24, and in fact, even teenagers not even legally able to, fly on a plane unaccompanied, let alone drive a car, let alone any of those things. And so I look at the vendors as being the ones who need to be responsible for writing more secure code and responsible for opening up their ears when somebody finds something.
Okay, so a question about the 5-year-old. Had he done something wrong...
he did. He broke the law, actually.
No, we're talking about, had he brought down, what was the network?
No, he didn't bring down the Xbox Live
I know.
Right.
What was the network? Xbox, you said?
Yeah.
Let's say he accidentally brought down the network. What sort of financial recourse would Xbox have? Take away his Play-Doh? You're saying it's 94%, but what you're not saying, what you're saying is public disclosure. No. Yes, I will totally disagree with you on that, because in the United States, if you deal with healthcare, if you deal with financial, if you are a public company, if you take credit cards, you have to have testing done. And a lot of these, it's through NDA. So every vulnerability we find, we have it. There's a big difference between bug bounties, which I think you have to be a very, very secure and open to a lot of issues to take a bug bounty. There's a difference between that and having professionals actually testing. Now, I don't disagree. I had a 19-year-old as an intern this year who blew my socks off. But the thing is he's human, just as all of us are human. And as businesses, as industries, we have to understand they're not going to be perfect every time. So how are we going to protect ourselves as an industry? We just say, whoops, he found an issue. Well, he was only 5, he didn't know any better. Or oops, they caused billions of dollars of damage, but they don't have any insurance, so sorry, not much you can do. That's why these companies, let's face it, are driven by money. They have to look at what is the risk associated with it, and not just what are the security implications. Most of these companies I deal with, and I deal with quite a few, are open to this, but they understand it. If they go too public with it, they're going to get sued. They get stigmatized in public. Bug bounties, unless you're very secure, or a bad idea. So they work with companies. I can't tell you any of the companies I work with because it's an NDA. It doesn't mean that they don't want people to know they're doing security. That's just the way it is. It's not 94% not doing anything.
Well, let's carry this on. Katie?
What I was saying was 94% have no way to reach them. So I was responding to your thing about, well, hackers should behave in a certain way and they should tell the vendor.
94%
if the vendor
of
has
who?
94% of the Forbes 2000. So these are the top companies, according to Forbes, in the top 2,000 of their list. And that means they've got tons of assets to protect, they're making a lot of money, and they're spending a lot of money on security, like pen tests and like appliances and firewalls and all that. They are hiring in-house staff, they've got threat and anomaly detection, they've got all this stuff, yet they have no way for anyone to report a vulnerability to them. If a hacker has to go through and try and tweet at a company and say, hey, where can I report a vulnerability to you? I have something I want to tell you about your security. I think that is a huge failing in the industry at large. And I think we need to address that problem because essentially that sets this tone where the hacker doesn't even know what is expected of them, of that vendor. They are just trying to find the right contact. Having started 2 vulnerability research programs, I started Symantec vulnerability research, I started Microsoft vulnerability research, I can tell you that even with the mantle of those giant megacorporations, I had a hard time finding the right contact at different vendors where we were finding vulnerabilities. If Symantec can't find the right contact, if Microsoft, with all of its partnerships, can't find a security contact, what hope does an individual security researcher have in identifying who to even tell?
The Fortune 2000, how many of them, what percentage would you say are actually client-based or server-based internal software companies?
I don't understand the relevance of your question.
Well, the relevance is, let's take back to the 5-year-old. The 5-year-old went on someone else's property and without their permission, yes, authentication bypass in their network.
No, that's not what happened. He wanted to play some games that his dad wouldn't let him play. So he messed around with the password field, logged in as his dad.
And what did he log into? What database was that stored in it?
He committed a crime under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He gained unauthorized access to somebody else's account and used it to play, first-party shooter game.
So if I come to your house and I take a key and I lockpick your front door and I open it and I go, hey, don't worry about it. This is just a vulnerability assessment and I just found a weakness. It's 2 different things you're talking about here. You're talking, and this is the clear, concise that we need to deal with, that we're not. A lot of security researchers say, hey, we're just doing this because we want to do good. The simple fact is your rights end where we say in the United States, your freedom of speech ends right here, okay? And it's the same when it comes to vulnerability research. Had that been Xbox that he, back in the 90s, been able to break copyright, that's an argument. He went to an online service and he actually violated a trespassing law. He violated a digital trespassing law. And at that point, there is a clear distinction there of why. And you're going to tell me that, well, it's your problem there is that Sony is the problem because they are not reaching out to him. I think the problem there is more of we are encouraging 5-year-olds to go to live networks that have real-world consequences and actually try to find security vulnerabilities.
So it was Microsoft because it was Xbox Live, and in 2007, when I joined Microsoft as a security strategist, I put up one line that said, if you report a security vulnerability in our online services, we will not pursue legal action against you. All that took care of was the civil liability. But the federal prosecutors could still go after those individuals if they wanted to, because it essentially said that Microsoft wouldn't sue them for damages if they gave a chance to fix it and reported something in online services. But they can't undo the law, and it's still a felony against the law. Now, with that in mind, what this kid did was, well, he technically, what he actually did, he entered the wrong password in the password field for his dad's account once, and then the next time, he just leaned on the space bar and filled up the password field with spaces. And that's how he got into his dad's account. Now, luckily, his dad was a security guy, and so he knew about the reporting mechanism at Microsoft, and he helped his son fill out this report to secure at Microsoft. Because Xbox Live was not eligible for the bounties, well, one, obviously we had already said back in 2007 that we weren't going to pursue any kind of civil lawsuit against that, but we gave that kid so many games. We gave that kid so many Xbox Live years of gold subscriptions. And quite frankly, I would have loved to, if I had stayed at Microsoft, invited him to be the youngest ever Blue Hat speaker to demonstrate to the developers and executives of Microsoft that anyone might be able to find a security vulnerability, whether they are security research professionally, a professional pen tester, a hobbyist, or just a user. And this was a very young user who happened to find, obviously, something that was sloppily left in the code for authentication of Xbox Live. That was Microsoft's fault. This kid pointed it out.
But just because, and that's good for Microsoft, but 94% of Fortune 2000 companies are not Microsoft. They are not software giants. And we have to understand that there's more to it than that. There's more at risk. Like you said, there's a lot of assets. And for people not to have a, quote, bug bounty or someone to report to may not be the worst thing out there. Now, I think one of the best solutions would be, is there a way through a more discreet method of being able to release these out? Yeah. Did you want to try one more?
Well, this gets into an issue. I know Mark and I, because I knew he wasn't making it, he wanted me to be a stand-in bad guy. Consequential damages. I discover a vulnerability in something. I then publish it. Some bad guys go, oh, that's really cool. I'm going to go do bad guy stuff with it and hurt people, and there is consequential damage down the line. Does that change any of the opinions on how we address vulnerabilities and disclosures? Consequential damages. You discover a vulnerability, you publish it, somebody else takes advantage of it and causes serious harm. Are you at fault?
So I think that there are various degrees of detail that you can publish with a vulnerability. Some vulnerabilities, just the description of it is enough detail for someone to reconstruct it. But in fact, even the publication of a patch, speaking of going back to reverse engineering, even the publication of a patch is a disclosure of a vulnerability. Everybody hear of Patch Tuesday, Exploit Wednesday? It's more like Patch Tuesday, Exploit Tuesday afternoon, a couple hours later.
So, can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
All right, Mark, we actually hear you.
I was able to hear all of that. So I'm going to speak because I don't know when I'm going to next get cut off. I think the French hate me. In any event, there are a number of issues here. One that Katie brought up before is criminal liability for hacking. So security testing, we have at least a half a dozen cases in the United States where people have been criminally prosecuted and some have gone to jail for pen testing, port scanning, reverse engineering code, attempted penetration, because under the theory that that was an unauthorized access to a computer or exceeding the authorized access to a computer. So anytime you're doing security testing and don't have the express permission of the developer or of the network owner, you run the risk of being criminally prosecuted, even if you're doing it at your own home. Now, the question about liability for publication of vulnerabilities is a number of things. One is the idea that you may be liable when somebody takes that code and uses it to hack into a network or exploits the vulnerability that you have now disclosed. So we have the concept of responsible disclosure that you should.
Oh.
All right, Mark. I will call you later. Thank you for trying. No microphone detected, and we've just got to continue on without you. My apologies to, or Skype's apologies to you. We'll just leave it at that for right now. Any comments on what he was saying there before we continue with a couple more questions?
I
let's say that you found a vulnerability in a, I did mean it that the French hate me. Let's say you found a vulnerability in nuclear power plants and a way somebody could get in and detonate it. And you put that on the front page of the newspaper. I don't know if anybody here remembers newspapers. But anyway, you might be liable if a terrorist or a bad guy then used that vulnerability to do something bad. So that would be the theory about irresponsible disclosure or negligent disclosure of a software vulnerability or a hardware vulnerability. The second thing is, if you disclose a vulnerability and that leads to a loss of sales by the company that has the vulnerability in their code, they could argue that you were disparaging their code in violation of the end user license agreement, even though what you were saying is truthful, and that you were interfering with their business relationships by pointing out the fact that their code was vulnerable, and they could sue you for lost sales. Now, I'm not saying they would win, but they could sue. So there's all kinds of risks associated with trying to do the right thing.
I think you're going to get a response, and hopefully you'll hear it, Mark. Dave first?
Yeah. Okay, so first, let's talk about two different things here. 0 days and first days, right? 0 day, there's no patch there. And to me, they're irresponsible, they're immoral, okay? And Mark, you just said anybody that would find a, quote, 0 day vulnerability in like a nuclear power plant, let's just say it's like a Siemens nuclear enrichment power plant by chance, and unleashed two countries, we won't mention their names, unleash this to maybe a third world country, put that onto the front page in the New York Times, and then, lo and behold, someone was able to, just by description, start to reverse engineer and mutate this to go after almost every SCADA network in the world. I would call that extremely immoral, whether it's the government or someone that does it. However, I will concede that once a vulnerability is out there and a patch is out there, that's a whole different game. It's on the client to actually put them on. Right now, we still see, was it MS-0867? We pwned a network last week for this. My God, it's their fault, right? But we are security folks, people. If there is a vulnerability, I was at a major conference in Louisville 2 years ago when Shell Shock came out. And instead of a group of people figuring out how to fix it, they were writing exploit code. We are security folks. This is not what we do. We help each other's security.
Katie?
I just want to follow up with something else that Katie pointed out, and that is that very few companies and even fewer software developers have a mechanism for you to report that you found a vulnerability, and worse, almost none of them outside of formal bug bounty programs have a mechanism for you to be compensated for reporting that. And as a result, there's very little incentive for people to look for vulnerabilities, and even less incentive for these companies to fix them.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that, put it this way, the risk to a security researcher to try to do the right thing, which we all agree, doing the right thing would be to try and report it to somebody who can fix it. That's the right thing to do, right? But the risk to a security researcher right now far outweighs any incentive, whether it's just the incentive of doing the right thing and feeling good about yourself, or in the small cases where organizations have started offering cash rewards in the form of bug bounty programs, which are actually just a different kind of pen test. I mean, it's just
totally different.
Right.
Different kind of pen test. I mean, I remember because I was back.
In fact, Katie, and I don't mean to
disagree
break you
with that
off.
100%.
Hold on, I was a pen
better
tester.
pen test.
Wait, stop. I was a pen tester back when it was hard to convince organizations to hire hackers under NDA to show them their weaknesses. I remember this. I lived this. And I remember that was the age where we had the skills. We were good people who knew how to do bad things. And we were trying to actually help organizations and be compensated for our skills and our work. There is nothing different about the average bug bounty hunter than that they are freelance agents trying to do the same thing.
Their skill sets is part of running a business. My wife and I have run a penetration test business for a while. I won't speak for Sis Dreams, but I can tell you there's a couple things that most security researchers have that we don't. Number one, how many millions of dollars of insurance do we have, Renee? A minimum of $5 million in general liability, about another $4 million in errors and omissions. So guess what? If we screw up, you're financially compensated. Number two, we have background checks. Number three, there is some sort of competency that we do on our testers to ensure that we are within scope. We don't go ad hoc, carte blanche, and go after everything. Again, there is skill sets, but that's not all penetration testing is. The second aspect of this is most companies, when we do pen tests, are asking us to do it. In many cases, if a company says, we do not want this, and it is their servers, it is located, housed on their environment, why are security researchers doing it?
I agree actually on the importance of scope. The importance of scope is very important, and that is why actually if organizations publish what they would like to hear about most, and what, especially if they're doing, even if they're doing just a vulnerability coordination program, I know everybody loves that word responsible, I won't use it, but you know, if they're doing a vulnerability coordination program with no cash rewards, publishing what's expected in terms of what they hope to hear from the security researchers, publishing things that they really would rather the researchers not do, in terms of violating, violating privacy of other users, doing physical attacks, all of these things that they really are saying, please don't do this and don't DOS us. But we would like to hear about the following types of vulnerabilities. That is very valuable. And obviously, when you're doing a bug bounty program, that's essential. These are the things we want to hear about and we'll pay for. These are the things that are out of scope. So I completely agree that even for the freelance, hobbyist, or bug bounty hunter, scope is an essential tool. And quite frankly, it's those organizations that have no reporting mechanism, not talking about bug bounties, but just no reporting mechanism where they don't define that scope. They are, in fact, not just cutting off potential researchers who they might even want to recruit or hire under NDA if they find something very particularly interesting. They're cutting themselves off from that. They're also cutting themselves off from being able to say, you violated what we asked you not to do. So I agree with you about scope. Even for freelancers, it's very important, but it falls on the vendor to define that scope and put it out there so that the researcher knows where they shouldn't go.
And likewise, if they have
let me
no
just
reporting
point out-
mechanism, they have not put any scope out there, you would agree that researchers shouldn't be touching their environment.
I think that sometimes
I
it
want
just
to point
happens.
out the differences between, I don't know if you can hear me, but
Yes,
I
we
want
can
to
hear
point
you.
out the differences between a bug bounty program and a pen test. So the big difference is in a pen test, you're paying for the test itself. Whether they find something or not, you pay for the test. In a bug bounty program, you only pay for what they find, and you can determine in advance how much you're willing to pay based upon the severity of what is found. In a pen test, you define the parameters of the test. This is what I want you to test, and this is where I want you to look. In a well-designed bug bounty program, you say, here's my IP range. Anything you can find is good. So normally you will wall off production environments. You will wall off parts that have sensitive personal information and say, that stuff I don't want to put out there. And the answer is, that's the stuff the bad guys are after. That's exactly what you want the bug bounty program to do. The third thing is, in a pen test, you're using professionals who have liability, who have insurance, who have certification, who have background checks. And in a bug bounty program, if it's well designed, and this is my personal opinion, you're using really, really bad people
who have no morals and no ethics and will try everything they can, but their morals and ethics are determined by their desire to get paid. And so they will agree to the terms and conditions because they want money from you in a responsible way. So the truth is, you're being pen tested every day. You might as well design a system that allows you to be pen tested in a way that you find the results and the bad guys, and not just the bad guys.
So I agree with your last point there, Mark. You know, you are getting pen tested every day, and the idea is to design something where you'll actually receive the report, right? But where I disagree about bug bounty hunters versus professional pen testers, number one, they are not mutually exclusive. There are professional pen testers
That's right.
who do bug bounties on the side. Number two, bug bounty hunters are not, as people would believe, primarily motivated by money. As you know, bug bounties are the lower end of payments that people could get for those types of issues. I know this because I started Microsoft's bug bounty programs, and I was paying only up to $11,000 for a critical vulnerability in the latest version of IE, and at that time it was IE 11. Each of those bugs could fetch 6 figures on the black market, or the offense market, essentially. What I was doing was I was appealing to the people who wanted to report the issues, but they had been inadvertently tricked by the only reward system that Microsoft had, which was your name in 11-point Arial font in a Microsoft bulletin. So what I was doing was I created an incentive. It was a much lower price than they could possibly get if they waited until after the beta period, and I created that incentive at the beginning of the beta period of IE 11.
Right.
Those researchers came forward, and they were absolutely not primarily motivated by money. Had they been so, they would have held, they would have waited until beta was over, and they would have sold to the highest bidder. So I disagree completely that bug bounty hunters are primarily motivated by money. Absolutely not.
And I would let's keep this civil. Let's not call people good or bad, because that's relative. I mean, let's just put it this way. A certain government paid $3 million for an exploit that could have been reported to Apple, but was instead given to some country to unlock an iPhone. Were they good or were they bad? Exactly. Let's just keep it as a security.
Mark, are you with us?
Yep. Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, one of the problems you have with a bug bounty program is, let's assume that somebody under one of these programs breaks into your system and obtains access to sensitive personal information. One of the questions is that a data breach that you have to report? On the one hand, the person was invited to try to break in, but they're also not an authorized person. So you may have created a situation where you are inviting data breaches that you end up having to report. That's one of the problems. The second problem is it was through almost like we need to have better incentives in the bug bounty program to justify the amount of time and energy that people will be using to try to find vulnerabilities. And these people are not particularly well trusted. So one of the questions is, if we have a bug bounty program and somebody breaks into our network, they can always say, oh, I wasn't trying to steal anything. I was actually trying to take advantage of the bug bounty program. So it makes it more difficult to prosecute hackers if you have a robust bug bounty program. All they have to do is say, my motive was really to find a vulnerability to report back to you, and therefore you can't prosecute me.
Dave?
Yeah, so number one, I want to just say this, first out. There are very, very few companies, maybe a handful of companies, with the security mature enough to handle bug bounties. And that's a problem, because right now they're in vogue. And some of the issues you do run into with bug bounties is, okay, let's say it's a segmented area. It typically is going to replicate your production. The problem could be there. Now, I'm not saying that everybody that does bug bounties are bad, but I can tell you from a security standpoint, and if you're running a SOC, you may not be able to tell between the malicious attackers and those that are actually just trying to help you with a bug bounty. And I can tell you there are companies we've been dealing with that are wanting to run bug bounties, and we're like, whoa, you guys aren't even patched yet. You're way up here. You need to be down here. So, I mean, bug bounties are not necessarily bad, but I mean, you're talking Google, Facebook, with thousands of geeks out there and with hundreds of responders for a single issue before you even get to that level.
So I agree that an organization needs some maturity, right, in order to handle it. I created a vulnerability coordination maturity model, and actually, because I was once a Linux developer who had to wear multiple hats, I created a Linux, vulnerability response program, and I was also a developer on their team. So the maturity model isn't necessarily on how many people you have dedicated to do this response or how big you are. I think that with the hundreds of different bug bounties that I've started over the past couple of years, especially in some of those highly regulated areas, there are ways around some of those risks that both gentlemen were talking about. For example, in an industry that is highly regulated where you have to actually report any breaches, what you can do is if you have a cloud instance, you set up a separate cloud instance and you have them test against that. That's one way to do it. That's very popular in these online healthcare type of folks who want to start a bug bounty program. Another way to deal with it, which Office 365 does, is that it requests that, and a lot of the online service bug bounties do, they request that you create 2 different test accounts or multiple different test accounts. So you're not breaching anybody else's data, you're just demonstrating that you could breach someone's data. There are technical solutions to all of these problems that people have brought up as to why this isn't going to work for them. The main thing, though, is the willingness to respond, and you've got 2 ends of the organizational spectrum. You've got the big complex organizations like Microsoft, like the Department of Defense, that have legacy code, but they also have a lot of resources to bring to bear. And that, I completely agree, those organizations need to kind of build up a very steady and measured approach. They need to start out slowly and build out, and they already have a lot of capabilities and resources. Then there's the other kind, the little shops that actually don't have much resources. However, they might actually be able to grow up with bounty. So essentially, they need to do the best they can to secure their code. They've got limited resources. And if they start a bug bounty program, they could start it small. They could start it as invitation only, which is a hybrid between the traditional penetration test and an open crowdsourced model. And they can kind of grow as their program grows and build their security response capabilities as they go. So there are multiple ways to deal with this problem of scale, scope, maturity, but I completely agree. Overall, you should be striving for the most mature levels as appropriate and as your business priorities dictate.
So just so I'm clear, you're saying on the second side, for software companies, for example, you may have developers that don't even understand secure code. They should, instead of maybe starting to train their employees, maybe starting to go down that road, it would be better of their resources to open that up to other people that will say, here's your problems, and yet they still really don't have any, they have limited resources, obviously, so they still don't have the developers to really fix the problems, but they're throwing hand over fist for bug bounties. Have you found a CEO or a CFO that actually went, good idea?
Absolutely, yes.
Are they out of business yet?
And the more important thing is, if an organization does not have the ability to fix bugs in its code, it's kind of like, so I know in Europe and in France and everything, you don't normally tip for service at a restaurant, but in the United States, it's expected that you will leave a tip for your server. It's a cost of you going out to eat. If you don't have enough money for the tip, you probably shouldn't have gone out to eat. If you don't have the resources where your developers are capable of fixing bugs, you probably shouldn't have released your thing to the market.
And if I was a wheel, I'd be a wagon. I mean, the simple fact is everybody's thinking productivity. We're on the same page here. I mean, I go into companies, and after we get done with the engagement, I go, crap, I'm using their product. But that's how the world works. I mean, but is it better to open them up to God knows what when they may not even have logging turned on, and you're saying, let's have it where people can start to look at their systems, can find weaknesses, and start paying these people, and hey, they won't be able to tell the difference between who's the good guy, who's the malicious force. I think that in the real world, you're setting yourself up for some major liabilities there.
Well, and I wasn't saying that they should just open themselves up to the world. I said they could start with invitation only. They could start with a handful of known friendly folks who might have actually gently and politely tried to report a vulnerability in the past and say, you know what, you were really nice to work with. Why don't we just invite you over here, and we've got this small pilot program that we're going to use, and we'd like to pay you for your work, but we can't afford to hire you full-time yet because we're a small company. You can absolutely start with a handful, with 2 or 3 or 5. In fact, even Microsoft, with its massive resources, employed that exact tactic before we started the bug bounty programs. If there was some particularly talented researcher that for whatever reason we couldn't hire them, either they couldn't, relocate, or they just, they're a bug hunting machine and they wouldn't have really fit into corporate culture very well, then we got them under individual penetration testing contract. That's a variation of what I'm talking about. Start out slowly in a manageable way. And I agree with you. It's not opening up, themselves to the world when they are not even patching the bugs that are in shared libraries out there.
But you just made a clear distinction there. You just said an individual pen testing. There's a huge difference between going to 1 or 2 trusted people and saying, please test my software.
Oh, I didn't say I trusted them all. I said I got them under contract.
No, you said trusted people that you could do invitation only.
Right, that's one way to do it.
That's one way to do it. That's called a penetration test.
No, it's not. If this person who's reported a vulnerability to you happens to be somewhere in the world and they happen to be 17 years old, you're not necessarily hiring them for a penetration test. You're basically saying, look, if you find bugs, I'll give you some money for each bug you find.
Okay, I want to take this into a direction a little bit now as we wind down that we have touched on the edges of. We've talked about the ethics and the morality of the white hat, the black hat, the gray hat, the motivations behind folks, whether it's the medical devices, the nuclear thing, or going to another country to get some code for an iPhone. The world in security is largely about attempting to control behavior, typically of the bad guy, bad code, what have you. This new world we're moving into with autonomous machines, that's Mark making noise, I believe, at his computer.
Yeah, I didn't know you could hear me.
Or, yeah, we can hear you chewing. As we move into the world of autonomous systems using hybridized neural networks where decisions are no longer binary, we have some ethical considerations. And one of the examples that we use as an ethical consideration, and you may have seen it in school, is there's a really fat guy. A bus or a car is going to kill 4 people unless you push the fat guy over the edge of a bridge and a train's going to kill him. What is the decision that you make? And that is an ethical, moral, personal, human decision. Now the question is, we're going to let Google decide this. We're going to let Tesla decide this. We're going to let BMW decide this. What if I am a researcher? Does that now constitute a bug because of my moral attitude, or is it truly a technical bug? And since we have to be looking to the future, and I know, Katie, that we got 94% of noncompliance and all that other stuff, this is the world that we're moving into very, very quickly. Do the same concepts apply?
So
tell me about
let me jump in here because these computers and software and cars do whatever we program them to do. And so when we talk about what's called the trolley problem that you've described is whether or not computers should be programmed to kill 1 person to save 4 people, okay? One of the big problems you have is the goal of BMW is to do one thing, sell BMWs. So should BMW, for example, prioritize the health and safety of their customer over the health and safety of pedestrians or drivers of other cars that they didn't sell. So they can sit there and say, well, I will save one customer, I will kill 4 pedestrians to save 1 customer. And because I want that customer to go buy another BMW, and if they're killed, there's nobody to buy my car. So there are commercial interests here that may outweigh or sway the morality of the computer program.
So I agree. The computers will follow our instructions. Pretty much, the algorithm dictates how they will behave in those situations. What I worry about is the security vulnerability that allows an attacker to override whatever safety and protection mechanisms are in there to do what the attacker wants that program to do, as opposed to whatever algorithm was designed to preserve whatever moral, stance that the manufacturer decided or that society regulated or however that's done. So let's say we come to some norms of acceptance around, a self-driving car swerving to hit a crowd versus versus swerving to protect its passengers. Let's say we come to that conclusion and we regulate that. I worry about the security flaws that would allow that to be overridden in favor of what the attacker's will. And that is the conduit of information that I want to preserve and be allowed to be passed to the people who can fix it.
I think this is kind of one of those trick questions, okay? And I think this is one of those areas that Woz and some of the other people are saying, autonomism, I can never say that word, is going to be an issue, because you say, okay, there's a fat man that is crossing the street and he may get hit, but it will save a busload of people. What if that is a fat man that is needing to join 6 or 7 of his kids on the sidewalk, and that bus is full of geriatrics? Okay, the situation is always evolving. The situation is always changing. I think one of the issues that we're going to run into, and Katie, no one can disagree with that, and that's always going to be an issue. I think one of the problems that we have to keep remembering is, in this world of smart, this is the smartest computer we will ever have. And from a security and from a safety standpoint, the reason the winners are always going to win, or the winners are always going to win, is because they're winners. The hackers will always win is because they are discerning. Just one area about, you talked about those cars, and there was a particular gentleman, if I have just 1 second to talk about this, where I see that this has gone awry. There was a gentleman who figured out that Jeeps, you could disassemble them, you could stop them. Two gentlemen.
Matching tracksuits.
Matching tracksuits.
Into a ditch as a result.
Most people don't know where St. Louis, Missouri is, but that's my hometown. That's one of the other gentlemen's hometown. This gentleman did this on the highway of where I live. And if you want to go read the article, they did not tell the reporter in the article what they were going to do. He was doing 70 miles an hour on a highway with a tractor trailer behind him. His words were, quote, "I was sitting there, my RPMs went up, my speed went down, a tractor trailer was about ready to rear end me. I was on a bridge that had absolutely no place for me to walk." I think right there is where we really have to start talking about why we have to have some sort of individualism and ideas of what's going on. I mean, not to person, but again, my family drives on that road. I drive on that road almost every day.
But right now, you've just turned, and I agree,
Yeah.
I think, I'm not
Yes.
sure at this point, but
I do.
security then is potentially a cultural issue and no longer just a technical issue.
So I absolutely agree that basically the people who were around that demonstration did not consent to that demonstration, and that was dangerous. What is strange to me as a proponent of vulnerability disclosure is that it took that kind of stunt and national coverage for people to actually go in to the manufacturer and get the patch that had been available for 1 month. Now, What that tells me is that not only, you talked about some of your customers who haven't applied the patches for MS08, 067, 08. That is an 8-year-old bug, and they haven't applied the patches for that. How can you expect consumers to apply patches for things like their vehicles or whatever it is when even IT pros are not applying 8-year-old security patches? Now, to me, that points downstream to the main issue, which is the manufacturers were not thinking about how do we get the patches to the things that we make such that it doesn't take some ridiculous stunt hacking in a national news article to galvanize people to apply the protections that we've provided for them. Microsoft had to, do Windows Update and whatnot to centralize the patching. Google did something else, which was force patching of the Chrome browser so that the user really doesn't have a choice. It happens kind of in the background, and if they don't apply the patch for a couple of versions, it won't actually render some pages, and it'll do the patching for them. Tesla has gotten over-the-air updates as part of their commitment to security. So I agree with you. The fact that that happened was dangerous. But the fact that it took that to get people to go in and patch their vulnerable devices is what's wrong with the vendor side of the industry and the response side of the industry. So that's the part that I really want to change. Because then, if that happens again, there's no excuse. You shouldn't be doing that. You don't need to do that to raise awareness. There's no excuse at that point. Let's remove all the excuses for doing dangerous activity like that.
Well, we should condemn it. We should condemn it as an industry, though, and that hasn't happened. And again, I know the gentleman. I've had beers with the gentleman. He's a great guy, but that could have been done on a parking lot. And unfortunately, it can breed an area where I think we can all agree this is not good. This is just not good.
Well,
So,
for everybody's
the other thing we need to worry
edification,
about
Mark,
is,
give me 1 second, please. I was just informed that we have to all be physically out of the building by 7 o'clock. So what I'd like to do is begin some wind-down comments. And since Mark has been with us and without us, Mark, I'm going to let you begin with some overall comments. We have about 10 minutes for the three of you to exchange some additional hostilities. So please, let me hand it over to Mark.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. So one of the big problems here also, Katie talked about Tesla doing over-the-air updates. The problems we have now are minuscule compared to the problems we're going to have with the adoption of the Internet of Things. Individuals are going to be responsible for updating the software on their light bulbs and on their toasters and everything like that. These are mini SCADA systems that have command and control that impact our real lives so that people can take over things and gather massive amounts of data. When we talk about software vulnerabilities, we also have to include in our analysis the vulnerabilities that are deliberately put in there, either to create backdoors for governments or intelligence agencies to capture information, or that are deliberately put in by vendors, suppliers, or producers so that they can capture information. So, for example, your car is equipped with
Our car was equipped. Okay. Mark, you have disappeared again, and I thank you for attempting to be with us. So in some final remarks, let me start with Katie. Or you want to start with, you want Dave to go first? All right, Dave, final remarks. Let's wind this down a little bit.
I'm actually a middle child as well, so just works perfect. I think we're this whole debate, we've been talking nuances, and that's a good thing. That really is a good thing to be able to, that the fact I can't say, Katie, I 100% disagree with you, or Mark, I 100% disagree with you.
But there are also vulnerabilities that allow good people in as well. Okay?
That is perfect. But, I think we could go on forever and ever and ever, but, security sucks right now. It really does. The number one thing I don't want government to do is to get involved in security. You look at Germany.
Too late.
Yeah, you look at Germany and England's solution to it, and they basically said if you have hacking tools, you're breaking the law. Good luck to anybody that holds a damn computer in those countries. You're breaking the law, and that is really the actual laws there. This is not the Wild West anymore. I grew up on BBSs in the 80s. I was on the internet in the late 80s, early 90s. It was the Wild West. We, as an industry, have to come up with some sort of solution. And Katie's right. We have to guide them. But the thing is we can't force them, and we have to, on both ends, we have to say, listen, you may not want to be tested right now, but I can guarantee you, from a financial standpoint, everybody else, all of your competitors are doing it. They're selling security. You're going to go the way of the dodo bird. But then we have to have some sort of guidance, like you've talked about with the bug bounty program. We cannot let it be a free-for-all. We have to be responsible about it. I'm amazed that, we are at the blazing trails of, this reminds me of the Renaissance with science and the scientific method. And in 200 or 300 years from now, people won't know us, but we're the ones building the security. And we have to deal with it in a way that helps civilization, that is not reliant on any one government, because they all will fail us and fail, and something that can stand the test of time.
Katie?
I think that we are ultimately all on the same side. We all want the computers that we use today and the devices and the technology that we depend on for the future to be more secure. The disagreements are in the nuances. And I think right now we're in a really interesting time, because those who are capable of pointing out the flaws and weaknesses are actually in the weakest position. And as more and more of these regulations and these organizations say to them, I don't want to hear about what you found, what they're really saying is, I don't want you as an ally in defense. And I think changing the norms of what vendors do is part of the essential fabric of actually everybody who is trying to report vulnerabilities, everybody who wants to secure their own networks and their customers' products and everything. Ultimately, we just have to realize we're on the same side, and how we get there is really the subject of this debate. And it's the subject of what we're trying to figure out across regulations and legislation worldwide. For me, I look at this from the perspective of one who has found bugs and tried to report them, one who has coordinated bugs across multiple different organizations with different maturity levels and encountered weird reactions from some of them, and as a vendor of both open source and closed source software with varying degrees of resources to respond. The will to respond and the will to work together is really the important part of all of this, and how we get there is going to be crucial as we increase our dependence as a society on the computers that we already depend on economically for our power, for our food supply, for all of these things. We are no longer at this luxury level where we can debate the nuances of this policy stuff. We need to figure out a way to work together, because ultimately, researchers who are trying to report issues and vendors who are making software and hardware are all ultimately on the same side. We want to make the world a safer place. Let's just get there.
Mark, if you're here.
And the last thing I'll say is I do believe in reverse engineering, and viva la revolución.
Mark, are you with us?
I am with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please give us your wrap-up on why Katie and Dave are so terribly wrong.
Because they always are. The answer is, look, we need to have responsible programs. It's very hard to encourage companies to open up and say to people, try to break into my system, I'll give you some money. And they're just not going to do it. They sell products and services that are sold on an as-is basis. And if you don't like it, buy somebody else's product. You don't have any particular right to try to break in, and I don't have any particular obligation to make my stuff secure. And as long as we have,
All right, on that note, I really apologize for, well, I don't own any Microsoft stock. I'm all right. Are we going to give him one? Mark? Continue, Mark, if you're here, or we're shot. All right. Listen, these guys here did amazing, and Mark did amazing for trying to stay connected. Please let's hear it for these guys, for the opinions. This is an incredibly important issue for us all. I want to thank you guys for hanging out so late this evening for this. And again, my apologies, and sell all your Microsoft stock tonight immediately if you can. And thank you. We'll see you tomorrow morning.